here we've got like a really special plant. We've been focusing more on the low-growing ones with the exception of the redbud, I guess. This would be what's called like an understory shrub. So kind of thinking about building your plant knowledge, and certainly in the permaculture view, it's this idea of stacking functions, and certainly naturally you'll always see this, what's called the herbaceous layer, the low-growing plants, this kind of understory of shrubs, and then you get into the small trees like the redbuds and the dogwoods and the above trees. And this is really more of a tropical family, but I'm sure that y'all are familiar with at least one member of this family from a lot of, in particular, desserts and baking and porridge and that sort of thing. So does anybody know the family offhand? Okay, does anybody know this plant offhand that I'm talking about? Spice bush, yeah. So good scratch and sniff plant. As you see, I've like kind of scraped it a little bit there, so I'll pass that around, and you can come and get a little bit of a branch if you want. So this is in the cinnamon family. It's in the Lauraceae family, named after the bay that you may have used in your beans or something like that, the bay laurel. But the spice bush is a native from that family, along with another really famous plant for flavoring that a lot of you will recognize, which is sassafras. And I think of the spice bush as something that can be used with tea. In the case of this time of year, just taking these stems, like the one that I just passed around, and putting that into a tea. Also, it will make red fruits if it's a female, because they have separate male plants and female plants. So you have to have a female in order to make these bright red fruits that are really good as like an allspice or nutmeg or cinnamon kind of thing for your holidays. They're going to come out in the fall, and then you could put that into your cakes and pies and that sort of thing. And then also this is really good food for wildlife. In particular, butterflies are very specific on the things that they feed on. As much as this is about food for us, we do have Ingles, Ingles and Whole Foods, but better yet, the Co-op, right? That's a great sponsor of Living Web and Earth Fare. And so these butterflies, they're very specific, and this is what I would plant rather than planting Elaeagnus, right? Because it's super useful, super yummy, takes up about the same amount of space, doesn't fix nitrogen like that, but you've got multiple uses from it, and it's gonna feed this special swallowtail butterfly as well that will only eat on this and on the closely related sassafras.
And this is something that the berries I use to make an Appalachian chai.
Yeah, yeah. And we've got some dried ones back in the kitchen, so we'll be making a fruit compote later, and that will be one of the spicy flavors that we'll have in the compote. Is coming from, it's called spice bush. Yeah, It's in the Lauraceae family, L-A-U.
It's the stems that are the spicy, or the leaves?
I've read about some use of the leaves. I haven't tended to really get into that so much, but there is some stuff in the literature about it. I tend to use the stems though. And that's gonna vary too, as far as the time of year. Like this is getting a little bit late. It's a lot like when collecting your maple sap and that sort of thing, that there'll be the sweetness that's coming through there, but then that sweetness transitions, and it's variable depending on time of year. I don't think the leaves are poisonous. I'll put in a quick plug for the book by Francois Couplin, The Encyclopedia of Edible Plants in North America. It's got 4,000 plus plants in there just for our continent alone. And he, as well as having the edible plants, he rates how choice they are. He also compares the plants of North America with the plants of Europe and the plants of Asia. Nice, yeah, that's a good one.
It's a big one.
It is a big one, that's true. And so we have that back at the kitchen. We've got a whole bunch of book resources actually. And if you're really interested in the details of that, it's very affordable. You probably find it $15 used. Encyclopedia of Edible Plants of North America.
So let's look at one tree over here, and I think we actually missed that plant.
Okay.
It's back that way.
So then we'll head back.
And there's another place we can see it. So anybody have any idea what this tree might be? There's some clues on the ground if you look. Right here. Yes. Ding, ding, ding. What did you say?
I think it's a black walnut.
Yes, it is a black walnut. So this is one of my favorite edibles of the area, is black walnut. And there's a lot of black walnuts around. It's pretty awesome. And what's great about nuts, if you're trying to live off of wild foods, like they store and they have protein and fat and really good fatty acids. And so greens are awesome, and I make a good portion of my diet greens. In fact, when you look at what comes out the other end, it's very clear what most of the food is going. When I was like 21 and I looked and there was green, I was like, what's happening? Am I sick or something? And then I realized, like, oh, it's okay. So, but anyway, if we are trying to subsist, which, you know, we don't necessarily have to, but it can be fun to make most of our food wild food, then these nuts are a really important part of our diet, especially if you're trying to be vegetarian. And so I gather large quantities of black walnuts every fall. And when I gather them, I take them, and they have those holes on them. Anyone have any interesting experiences with the holes?
Black hands for weeks.
Black hands for weeks, yes indeed. So, and they're kind of a pain to get off, huh? So I put them on my gravel road and let my neighbors drive over them. And so very quickly I'm able to take the holes off, and I wear gloves when I do it because I teach, and although my fingernails are pretty dirty from gardening, the whole stained hand thing can be a little, I don't know about this girl. But black walnuts are super tasty. I have a very busy life. I have like apprentices and all these people around and teaching classes and organizing stuff on the computer and all these things. And I have this little meditation spot where I have a bucket of walnuts and a nutting stone. And so I go there and crack black walnuts and eat them. And it's like this awesome meditation for me in my life. They're really amazing in cookies. Although I don't eat cookies, sadly. But they have such a strong flavor that they kind of come through the cookie. They're really good in ice cream. I like to eat them on salads or just by themselves. And if I eat like 5 black walnuts, I'm pretty set for a few hours. They're really strong, powerful food. And that's something that I'm just going to try to condense this because it does now actually seem to be raining. But that's something that these wild foods are much more concentrated. And so the reason that I think of why wild foods are more concentrated than domesticated foods is how much do you make at the market when you're selling a super concentrated food? Not nearly as much because you don't have the same number of pounds. Like if you're selling a tomato that's much more concentrated than somebody else's tomato, then you are able to grow less of those tomatoes because that other person just has more water in their tomato. Does that make sense? And so these wild foods haven't been bred to have a higher water content. They are just super potent foods. And like, do I want to make myself be a more bloated, higher water content, not as concentrated person? No. I want to eat concentrated foods. And so I think that eating wild foods can really make us more like wild creatures, which I really like. Because you do want to be more like a pig or like a deer. You know? Or a wild hog versus domesticated hog. Arr, wild hog. Cool. So you're freeing it up?
I'm trying. Look. This is a plant that is one of the exotic invasives that doesn't really have too much use to it, called Oriental bittersweet.
Oh, there is actually one very good use for it.
Oh, well, yeah.
Which
sure.
is
craft style, you mean?
Yeah, you can make awesome basketry out of it. It's pretty great.
Which is the case with a lot of vines, and in particular some exotic invasives. This one, as well as kudzu, of course. Although kudzu is eminently edible too. This one's more poisonous.
But it's pretty cool. You can, so see how I'm holding my knife on top like this? That keeps you from cutting your other hand as you're splitting the vine. So I just start with my knife. And then once I'm in, which I didn't quite get centered, see how you can split the vine? So this is an awesome basketry material.
There's potentially some medicine in it as well.
Isn't that fun? See, our bodies were made to do this stuff. Meant to eat wild foods and make stuff out of plants. So fun.
To circle back around to the black walnut, I would also put this up as one of the chief anti-parasitics of the native plants that we have around here. And you'll often see it in combination with wormwood together to that regard. And I've actually made good money harvesting the black walnuts and then shipping them to companies that are tincturing it, making medicines from it. In that case, it's the green hull. So it's when it first drops before it turns brown. That's when you're going to take it for medicine. And then beyond that, this is one of the chief natural dyes of the area, like as far as the eating with your eyes thing.
Oh,
and
this, in fact,
yeah.
was dyed with black walnut.
So there you
This
go.
is the brain tan buckskin dyed with the black walnut.
Yeah, and unlike a lot of dyes, this doesn't need a mordant oftentimes. The color will stay. It's strong enough to stay by itself rather than having to add certainly heavy metals, which I tend to stay away from, but even things like acids or iron or something would be often compounds you would add to a dye to get the color to stay.
And the roots of black walnuts actually have an even stronger dye than the hulls. And sometimes they'll, like at my place, there's a black walnut growing right next to the bridge. And then there's all these little black walnuts that have sprouted and they're like knocking out the cinder blocks holding up the bridge. And I appreciate that black walnuts have been here much longer than cinder blocks, but the bridge is very useful in my life. So I've been pulling them.
And speaking to the roots, I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar that black walnuts are one of these plants that is a liliopathic. They will inhibit the growth of other plants through these compounds that are in their roots. And comes to mind this whole list that Cooperative Extension has, which if you're not familiar with Cooperative Extension, you're into gardening and learning more about plants, that's something definitely to familiarize yourself with. And they have a whole list there that says things that will grow under black walnut. Or you could just observe by nature too what's growing there. But like tomatoes, for instance, really don't like it.
Oh, it's funny.
So.
I had great tomatoes under my black walnut
Wow.
tree last year. And so
Interesting.
I've been having this theory that the black walnut, what I've heard is it's when water touches the leaves and drips onto the ground is the allelopathic
Right.
thing. And so I've heard that, but the black walnut leaves have antifungal qualities
Yeah.
because they're used for athlete's foot and stuff. And so I had this theory that
Right.
it
I
was
keeping
anti-blight.
Right.
But maybe they don't. Maybe they're bad for the
know.
tomato plants, but they're good for keeping the tomato plants to not have blight.
Yeah,
I don't
right.
know, because I had tomato plants under the drip line of
Yeah.
the black walnut and they did great, and then I had other ones not, and they.
Huh.
So I
Okay.
don't know. It's
Oh.
interesting, that science sometimes.
And I mean, that brings to mind too that as much as we know, which is a lot, but there's always more to know. And it's taken a lot for us to get to this place that we can share this voluminous amount of information. We'd love it if you wanted to share back your experiences, your stories, come and tell us about the things that you go on to do with these foods or how you observe them being different at different times of year. And certainly Botany Every Day is a great resource for that, to be able to comment at the website or on the Facebook group. But I'm always looking, whether it's with us and how much it has taken us to get to this place to share with you, or with the plants, how can we enact reciprocity, right? And so that it's not just like, what can I get, but also what can I give back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. Yay, reciprocity!
Yay, reciprocity!
Yay! So if anyone wants to harvest any of these for basketry, especially the slightly smaller ones, you are more than welcome to, I think.
Just to frame where we're going to be going from here, we're going to head back pretty shortly, and there's definitely more people than there will be more stations for food. So I've got a bunch of book materials that you could check out. One thing you could do is be a little investigator in real time, look up a factoid to share with the group. Another thing is, if you wanted to play around with this, maybe we could have a little section off to the side with the Oriental bittersweet or other vines as we're getting out here. Japanese honeysuckle that's everywhere is another famous vine for baskets that you can make something really quick.
And we will all switch out too.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone want to harvest them?
I've got pruners here if you want to step
It's
on
pretty
up.
fun.
Okay,
Get the pruners.
here you go.
Awesome. I have my knife too. Yes.
I've got an
Oh, you have one. Okay, cool. Awesome.
So what method would you use for weaving with these?
You know, I've used the smaller bittersweet vines. I've used to make a basket fairly similar to this. But for bigger stuff, I would probably do more of a free form like I do with kudzu basketry. This core is brittle, so I'm removing the core. Did you hear that pop earlier? That was the core. See how it's like a little vine in itself, but it's brittle. Whereas this other stuff has more strong fibers. It's pretty cool.
I've used the hulls of black walnuts for shoe polish also. Like
Oh,
inside there,
fun.
brown stuff inside there. Yeah, if you have the right color of leather on your shoes, it works great.
That's awesome. That's a really good one. I like that. And you can get really variable colors with black walnut. One thing I'd really suggest if you're dyeing with black walnut is to definitely strain it really well. So you want to take a volume of walnuts and then you cover, and I just go ahead and leave the nuts in there because I find that the dye is stronger, because there's also dye in the shells and in the nut itself, in the nut meat itself. And so I'll just fill a container with walnuts and then I'll pour water over it and give myself a few inches over the level of the walnut holes. We're talking big pot here. And then I do put in a couple rusty nails to give it a little bit more of a depthness of color. The iron oxide, the rust, is a really great color enhancer. And so then I simmer that down, generally on my wood stove because of the time of year, and because I don't like to use a bunch of propane to cook down dye, because that's just sad and wasteful. Use up dinosaurs to make dye. It's kind of sad. Food, you know, I can justify. But so I boil it down for several hours and then I strain it really well, because if you don't strain it when you dye, it gets all splotchy. So, yes. Okay, well,
Yeah, let's hit that.
Marc's doing a great example. Look at all those wild onions. Let's get them before we go, and then let's go.
Harvest while we walk.
Yay.
Sure.
Is it a weed killer, a replacement for Roundup? Have you heard about that?
I haven't.
Yeah.
I haven't.
Because if you see the walnuts by itself, by nature,
I'll strip them, and if you
there's
want to
no
cut off
weed
the
around the fruit. You know?
Around the holes themselves.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, someone told me that. I never used it. You know?
Yeah, that'd be interesting to experiment with, for sure.
Where you see walnut,
There's no weeds.
weed
Yeah,
around it, yeah.
totally. Yeah, that's cool.
So we've got a really super amazing choice green of this time of year, and also of the indigenous people of this area, the Cherokee. This is a well esteemed and kind of favorite vegetable to point out that we have here.
Pick a couple of these. And
And-
this is, oh, go ahead.
Well, does anybody maybe recognize it offhand or have a guess about the family or what plant might be? Yeah.
It's really cool. I was, the news came to my place the other day to film the garden school, and the cameraman was a real soft-spoken guy. I was like, okay, he's not too into this stuff we're doing. but interesting. And at the end, when he'd finished filming, he said, I see you've planted sochan. And he was like, where I come from, we eat that a lot, but we don't plant it, we just gather it by the rivers. And he was from Cherokee. And so that's something that I've heard a lot, is that it's one of the Cherokee's favorite greens. Yeah. And it does really well under cultivation. Like, it grows much larger and grows a lot more green. So this is a really good one to bring into your garden. And here, I mean, it's awesome that it's growing here, and I wouldn't necessarily like take a whole bunch from this one, but like there's places where there's sochan everywhere.
And I think of it more as a cooked green, but we're going to pass them around and just take a little nibble of it, because like the daisy it's related to in the same family as, it's got a very distinctive flavor as well. Yeah, it reminds me of echinacea, which echinacea used to be in this genus. I remember Rudbeckia is the genus of black-eyed Susans are very closely related to sochan. So I'm sure there is like some medicinal aspects that are going to be happening here as well.
It's like a giant leaf version of it.
Yeah, and just another thing to point out, because it does tend to grow in moist environments, at least superficially and maybe less so for some people, it could look a little bit like water hemlock, which is going to grow in moist environments. The sochan is going to tend to have little hairs on it. Not always, but most often it's going to have little hairs. And water hemlock is going to be smooth and have no hairs. So that's one way that you could just clearly rule that potential mistaking out.
So yeah.
So do you subscribe to the advice that it's supposed to be cooked in the water and have the water thrown off, or do you just cook it straight up?
Yeah, I mean, I won't cook it straight up, to be honest. But there is the, like poke, this idea of cooking in water and pouring the water off. And I think somewhat the difference is the dosage too, and that's really, I think, relevant to point out is like when I'm eating from the wild, typically I'm eating like 30 things, a little bit of each rather than a ton of just like one or two things. If you're going to make a whole meal out of something, then you need to be a little bit more cautious as far as the method of preparation and what compounds you might want to get rid of through that preparation, versus if it's just, you know, 5% of this and 5% of that and maybe 10% or 15 or 20% of something super palatable like chickweed, you know, for instance.
And there's some, you know, like this plant is something that I eat without preparation aside from cooking all the time. But something like milkweed, you definitely need to cook it. And poke, you definitely need to process it in changes of water, even if you're eating a small amount.
Yeah, so I guess just to follow up with this idea of really employing this knowledge, right, that it's, for me, it's like being a reporter, using all your question words, getting the whole story, right? So it's, who is this plant? How can I use it often? But then the next thing is, how are you going to employ that use? Cooked, fresh, raw, in oil and vinegar, in, you know, in alcohol, for instance, with medicinal compounds. Sometimes they're extracted in alcohol. Where to harvest, what time of year to harvest. All of these things are important things to pay attention to. And something that comes to mind is there is a radio show that is attached to the Living Web Farms initiative, and I was on that show a few days ago, and we've thrown a lot of information out at you, but if you want to review it, you can listen to that Earth Heart Radio for free and have a little bit of a review in that regard.